can see many new faces in our audience this evening, and I welcome you all. But I thought I'd just start by telling you a little bit about what we, the BIAA, the British Institute in Ankara, do. We conduct research in Ankara in a wide range of subjects, covering, well, our focus has always been archaeology and ancient history, but we now cover subjects in the arts and the humanities, in climate and environmental sciences, cultural heritage management, social and political sciences, in a very wide range of topics. And this evening's lecture falls in our contemporary lecture series. I have to say that I'm very surprised to be standing here this evening to introduce a talk about football. I feel the least qualified to say anything about football, but I'm really looking forward to your lecture, John. I'm really looking forward to learning more than I think I know about football, and that's not saying much. But let me just tell you a little bit about our speaker before he takes the stage. Dr. John McManus is a social anthropologist specialising in the study of sport, digital media and migration in Turkey and the Turkish diaspora. He holds a master's degree in modern Middle Eastern studies and a PhD in anthropology, both from the University of Oxford. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the BIAA, based in Ankara, where, among other things, he is exploring the role of sport among Syrian refugees. But John has been studying Turkey and its football for almost a decade. During that time, he has looked at the game and its role in social and cultural life form from a host of angles, including football's entwinement with left-wing politics, its media ecology, the commercialisation of fan groups, and football fandom amongst Turkish-speaking groups in Europe. His work has been published in a range of outlets, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies and Sociological Research Online, the BBC and The Guardian too. Welcome to Hell, or Welcome to Hell, is his first book. Please join me in a warm welcome to John McManus.
Thank you, Shahina, for introducing me. Thank you to Simon, also at the BIAA, who organised tonight, and thanks most of all to all of you for coming, some of whom have done so from a very far way away, or at great expense and cost. So I'm touched to see you all. My book, as the title perhaps might suggest, is here it is, just getting used to it, it's a mainstream book. I've stepped out of the academic fold. I've decided a topic like football has broader appeal and and especially its role in Turkey, which maybe some of you are aware, football is a huge part of life in Turkey. It deserved kind of mainstream treatment. As a result, also this talk, I thought, deserved mainstream treatment. So I'm going to be talking in quite broad terms, quite simplistically. Hopefully, Shahina, anyone else who football perhaps is not their métier will be able to follow. We'll see. So I wanted to start just by talking about the title with its question mark that Shahina alluded to. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it yet. For British football fans, if you mention Turkish football, this phrase is what normally springs to mind. And the reason for that is linked to a football match in 1993 when Manchester United travelled to Istanbul to play Galatasaray. And as the Manchester United team left the airport arrivals hall, they were met with about 100 Galatasaray fans screaming, shouting and holding banners, one of which said in English, "Welcome to hell." without the question mark. That was more of... Then ensued a rather lively 24 hours where the Manchester United team coach was stoned, the Manchester United fans were kind of beaten up by the police, held and then deported, and the team went on, Manchester United, to draw 0-0 with Galatasaray, going out of Europe, and for good measure, the players got a little bit of a push and a beat by the police as they left the pitch. So the whole experience from a British point of view was kind of encapsulated in this phrase, and Turkey was seen as this unfair land where, you know, people were you know, engaging in this sort of behaviour. Then 7 years later, in the year 2000, this image became crystallised when 2 Leeds United fans were tragically killed in Istanbul. They were stabbed by Galatasaray fans, and that really, for obvious reasons, kind of cemented this image of football in Turkey as full of brutality, violence, and unfairness. And I first arrived in Turkey in 2008 and started getting interested in its football almost immediately. And my welcome was anything but hellish. I was embraced, shown around, treated like a guest, and over the years came to develop a strong rapport with many fans and realised that Turkish football fanaticism has many, many levels and great depth. So I want to just begin by reading, foremost amongst my early experiences was research with Beşiktaş fans in 2009. And I want to begin my talk, which is not going to be too long, don't worry, but I want to begin it with just a little short extract from the book. It was through Beşiktaş fans that I began to truly love Turkey and its football. More accurately, it was through Özgür. Of a similar age to me, Özgür had a big round belly, a laugh like a hyena, and an extreme distaste for drinking chilled water, which even in temperatures of 30 degrees, he believed would make him sick. I have a picture of, this is Özgür down here. Özgür became my friend and guide, the only person who didn't seem to mind me attaching myself like a limpet, asking endless questions. I ended up spending 3 months with him and his Beşiktaş gang in Istanbul, being introduced to the fan leaders, going to matches, and hanging out. During games, Özgür would grab me around the shoulder and hoist me onto the seats. He would lace his arm through mine and compel me to jump up and down in time with him and the rest of the stadium. When a goal was scored and the crowd turned to lava, pouring over the rows and causing hundreds to fall over, he would brace himself and hold me up, like someone trying to stop a beach umbrella from being taken off by the wind. Özgür instructed me in the art of shelling sunflower seeds with the teeth, discarding the carcasses on the terrace. And he taught me how to sing some of the Beşiktaş chants. And what chants? My poor Turkish meant I couldn't distinguish the words at first, only feel the force. I would turn, petrified that there was a huge riot taking place, only to see people with smiles on their faces, twirling their scarves and singing. It was no surprise to learn that Beşiktaş jostles for position amongst the world's loudest sports crowds. At a match in September 2017, a player for a German team, RB Leipzig, had to be substituted after 32 minutes because the noise was so intense that it made him, quote, dizzy. I learned that there were chants for kickoff and chants for corners. There were songs about love, songs about death, songs about shafting Galatasaray and Fenerbahce, and songs designed to comfort and console whenever Beşiktaş lost. Every kind of footballing emotion had its place in the chanting repertoire. In that sense, the experience was truly operatic. So, in Turkish football, there are 3 teams which dominate: Beşiktaş, and Fenerbahce, and Galatasaray. And I think it's for this reason that the publisher went and put them on the cover, the three colours of the teams. So each club lays claim to tens of millions of fans. and their histories and rivalries dominate the country. All three are actually older than the nation of Turkey itself, being founded in the Ottoman era. And all of them are from Istanbul. So as you'd expect, there is a fierce rivalry amongst them. A century of living cheek by jowl never helps on that front. And if football in Turkey is defined by one characteristic, it is arguably intense partisanship. When I arrived, one of the first questions that was asked of me was, "Hangi takım tutuyorsunuz?" Like, which team do you support? So the Turkish verb for football support is tutmak, which literally means to hold. So really, people, when they ask each other in Turkish, they're saying, which team do you hold? Which I think is a much closer, more evocative image. And in Turkey, everyone, in my eyes, must be or pretend to be a fan. Close to 90% choose one of these big three sides. And even if you don't like football, you are kind of forced in a way to adopt the team of your families or your lovers. There is intense jockeying over those whose affiliation is still up for grabs. Babies and outsiders, mostly. So with these clubs, there's a vast range of baby merchandise. Uncles, brothers, and dads, this is a very male phenomenon, trying to secure a kid's future loyalty. So I had a story told to me of a 2-day-old baby whose Galatasaray-loving father and uncles took him out of the crib and painted his penis yellow and red. It's maybe an extreme example. Which side? Galatasaray, Fenerbahce, or Beşiktaş? I was seen like an evangelist who was sizing up a potential convert by a lot of the fans. So when I first got there, I was very loath to choose. But in time, I realized that it wasn't anything personal. This desire to assign people to categories isn't limited to football. More generally, in Turkey, standing on the threshold is highly difficult, even subversive. People see not so much the individual as more the invisible network of social connections that gather around them. So for outsiders like me, whose family, occupation, social class was harder to understand, football affiliation became even more important. It's a way of bringing you into the Turkish schema, furnishing you with a group, because everybody has to be part of a group. And there are many negatives to this obsession with the big three in Turkey. I mean, there are obviously hundreds of football teams that aren't one of those three, and they have very few fans. Hard for them to hold on to their players. There's a nauseating sense of self-entitlement. This sense of being too big to fail, helped out by the government if the going gets tough. And politicians are always careful to tiptoe around for fear of alienating a third of the electorate were they to make a bad comment about one of the three. But they are also Turkish football's lifeblood. If you go to Beşiktaş or Kadıköy neighborhoods on a match day, you will see thousands of people chanting, eating, drinking, having fun. And if there's a derby match, then that expands even further. The city, the country will grind to a halt for a couple of hours whilst everyone watches. And if you submit to one of these teams, faults and all, then you're hot-wired into life in Turkey, I found. You have a horse in the race, not simply on the pitch, but in wider life, an instant common bond with millions. And what of politics? So none of the big three or their fans are political with a capital P, I would say. Even Çarşı, the fan group for Beşiktaş, who I'll speak more about shortly. I think it's important to view politics in football not as kind of a political platform, but more kind of diffuse sets of ethics and morals. And it definitely comes a distinct second to supporting the team. It's the main goal of the fans. But having said that, you can't deny a connection. Football in Turkey is political because everything in Turkey is political. Especially any decision about how and when thousands can amass. This is intrinsically political, especially given recent clampdowns on public gatherings. It's political because fan leaders are in charge of a kind of raw, rare, uncontrollable power of the crowd. And it's political because the authorities recognize this and act accordingly, with police, with laws, with discouragement. So the big three teams dominate Turkey's sporting landscape. But Turkey's most important footballer played for none of them. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, best known to the world as Turkey's irascible, mercurial president, nowadays his reputation has become more controversial. There's been a crackdown on human rights and freedom of expression, as many see that in Turkey, so his reputation soured in the eyes of the West. But most of the outside world is unaware, as this picture shows, that Erdogan was quite a serious footballer. While still at high school, he began playing for an amateur football side. In 1974, a year after he graduated, he moved to IETT, an Istanbul team linked to the Transport Authority, like as if TfL had a side. There he played for 7 seasons in a variety of positions. "I loved football. It was my passion. It entered my dreams at night," he said years later. As a politician, Erdogan has upset secularists in Turkey for bringing more religion into the public sphere. Even back then, this theme was visible. His teammates would call him Hoca, religious teacher. Erdogan and his coach used to take them on trips to the Eyüp Sultan Mosque, where Erdogan would lead them in prayer. He says in an interview in 1994, "We won all our matches in Eyüp," therefore vindicating the decision to pray beforehand. "Belief is 50% of success. Even Maradona used to kiss a cross when heading out onto the pitch." So there's a big debate in Turkey over how good a footballer Erdogan really was. He claims that he was almost signed by Fenerbahce, and this claim is disputed strongly by his critics. It's testament to the divided and polarized nature of Turkey today that, depending on who you read, Erdogan the footballer is either a total charlatan or Istanbul's answer to Pele. Aged 27, when most footballers are hitting their stride, Erdogan left the municipality team and packed in football. Other elements of his life were becoming more important. He was involved in religious-inspired parties with their roots in conservative neighbourhoods, like the one where he grew up. And he climbed the ranks, first as a young party official, and then in 1994, he became mayor of Istanbul. 2002 saw his next party win a general election, and he became, subsequently, prime minister. The most powerful man in the country ever since. So today, football remains a central part of Erdogan's macho, populist persona. And indeed, in Turkey, the game is entwined quite strongly with notions of virile masculinity and hero worship. Therefore, it's a very useful tool with which to bolster a reputation. Erdogan still takes part in games well into his 60s. This is from a charity match in 2014 in which he scored a hat-trick. He frequently attends games, and afterwards he often descends to the dressing room after matches to congratulate players. So under a decade and a half of Erdogan's leadership, football has mirrored wider changes that have taken place to Turkish cities and socio-economic life. There's been a huge increase in wealth. The Super League, the top division, is now the 7th largest in Europe in terms of revenue. There's been a concomitant increase in ticket prices. Merchandise proliferates, and shiny new stadiums dot the landscape of Turkish cities. And it has also brought a surge in regulation, including new ID systems, increased security, and inflated punishments for fans who misbehave. So far, so familiar to football fans across Europe, Turkey is not unique in this regard. But in Turkey, all these developments feel like they've taken place on warp speed, with an increasing suggestions of crony capitalism and a rate and scale of change which is unrivaled anywhere else. There has been pushback against this. The construction boom, the increased public displays of religion, the limiting of freedom of expression, and perhaps the zenith of opposition to Erdogan and his view was June 2013 in the Gezi Park protests, named after the park in Istanbul in which the protests started, but which became a nationwide series of protests, the largest in recent history. As is so often the case, football made its way right to the centre of this politics in the form of one fan group, Çarşı for Beşiktaş. This is a picture of them in 2013. So Çarşı battled with the police, acting as the muscle for the diverse movement of protesters. Of course, Çarşı, being football fans, had experience of the increasingly aggressive manner in which football had been policed over previous years. And so their involvement in the protest was so prominent and successful that something quite strange happened. Fans of other teams started to pitch in. Supporters, in the colours of their hated rivals, Fenerbahce and Galatasaray, would stand arm in arm with them. Some would have pictures taken in front of the Çarşı stand at the protests, with signs saying, "Teşekkürler Çarşı," thanks Çarşı. Here's an example. So at the time, many people involved in this movement saw it as a turning point. There was an infusion of energy and hope into a young generation. Meetings were held in parks, protests rumbled on. Many saw Gezi as a resetting of politics. But in fact, from the point of view of government critics, things got worse rather than better. Shortly after the protests, 35 members of Çarşı were put on trial for their role. They were accused of attempting to overthrow the government. They weren't convicted, but the 2-year case took its toll on the group, which was perhaps its main intention in the first place. And Turkey entered a dark period. The country became increasingly sucked into the wider turmoil in the region. Over 3 million refugees came across the 900-kilometre border with Syria. And when I moved to Turkey full-time in 2015, 3 days after I touched down, 2 bombs tore through a crowd outside Ankara train station. It was the first of many disruptions and pain that would increasingly come to define my time there, culminating, perhaps most worryingly, in the 15th of July 2016 attempted military coup. So, when this coup arrived, it was slap bang in the middle of my research and writing, and I faced a bit of a paradox or a dilemma. As I explained at the beginning, the whole idea of the title and the premise of the book is to correct what I see as a really unfair image of Turkish football fans and Turkey in the UK. But at the same time, there was no denying that we were going through a very dark period, and it would be naive and perhaps even wrong to skirt over those dark periods or to ignore them. And often over, the next few years, right up to now, on a day-to-day basis, when I'm going about my life in Turkey, it's frequently Turkish football fans who pull me out of bad moods, or if I'm feeling particularly bad about something that's happened, either to myself or someone I know, or just the general country. Frequently, it's football and the fans who add the spice of colour, lift my mood. And I want to share a few anecdotes in order to show this side. And I do so not to gloss over some of the more negative or other aspects, but just because I think it's a side which is less well known in the UK. For instance, there is an obsession in Turkish football with numbers, especially the year in which the clubs were founded. So for Beşiktaş, this is 1903. So cue the 19th of March, the 19th day of the 3rd month. which is now claimed as Beşiktaş's birthday. And also the time of 3 minutes past 7 in the evening, which is also really important. People take screenshots all the time of their phones at this moment and share them on social media. When Beşiktaş had a 110-year celebration, the celebration started not at 7, but at 3 minutes past. When in 2017, Bursa and Fenerbahçe played a match, it had to be delayed by a few minutes because people threw flares on the pitch, meaning that the game kicked off at 1903. Fenerbahçe were founded in 1907. The incident drew such a big reaction from Fenerbahçe fans, they accused the Football Federation of being complicit with Beşiktaş. And the Federation was forced to make a statement to defend themselves as to why the game kicked off at 3 minutes past 7. There is also a very, very fun obsession with colours. So Beşiktaş play in black and white, which means that Beşiktaş fans often say, we hate colours. And in fact, I have some pictures here. This says, a manly man doesn't support a colourful team. So this is an example of the sort of both the virile masculinity and also the obsession with colours, into two in one. So I had a green jacket, which I was very fond of, but I had to retire this for wearing to matches because everybody assumed that I was a fan of Bursaspor, which is the hated rivals of Beşiktaş. And this goes to extreme levels. Once, when I was in a restaurant with fans and I was about to squirt ketchup on my chips, I felt like an arm reach across and stop me. And a fan said, in a grave voice, "Be careful." You know what that will mean? To which I looked at him completely gone out. No. Ketchup on chips. Red on yellow. Galatasaray. I squirted it on anyway. But perhaps one of my most favourite rituals of the Turkish football fan scene is what I call the airport greet. So this sees fans gather at the airport to welcome a new signing to their club. And so when the player emerges out of the baggage hall, he is met with hundreds of chanting supporters, kind of the reverse of the Manchester United experience. Here they're welcoming, but with lighting flares and all competing to try and hang a scarf at the new side round his neck. And this is reserved mostly for foreign transfers, and it taps into this really strong sense of hospitality in Turkey to the guest, to the outsider. "I must have looked like a rabbit in headlights," wrote former England striker Darius Vassell about his own airport greet when he arrived to play for Ankara in 2009. It's a bit pixelated, but it's good enough to show him looking a little bit kind of unsure as to what is going on. I suggest you watch the YouTube videos. People were bouncing up and down, chanting, "Darius Vassell, Darius Vassell, ole, ole, ole." And there were thousands of supporters there to greet me with flags, shirts. They made such a noise. So me personally, I have to confess, I've written an entire book about football, but I have never witnessed an airport greet firsthand. In summer 2016, when Slovakian defender Martin Skrtel was on his way from Liverpool to sign for Fenerbahçe, I vowed to be present at his triumphant welcoming. So I sent many messages to various fan groups on Facebook. None replied. That's fine, I thought. They're obviously too busy preparing the flair and the banners and rehearsing the chants. It's all right, I'll go. So from my house to the airport took over an hour. And as I was going through the strict security, I headed into the arrivals section. I was scanning, looking desperately for the yellow and blue, which would signal some Fenerbahçe fans. I couldn't see any. And then at that exact moment, my phone suddenly beeped. It was a message from one of the fan groups. So underneath my finely crafted question in Turkish about Skrtel's arrival, there was a short answer in English. No. Slowly the message grew, the fan referring to various foreign forwards who used to play for Fenerbahçe in the past. He said, Van Persie and Louis Nani, striker. Skrtel, defence. Important striker for Turkish fans. Then he broke off and started a new conversation. There's one thing you have to write in your book, he told me. Fenerbahce fans, 25 million. If it's necessary, we'll set the world on fire. And I was struck again by this thing which I saw again and again as I was travelling throughout Turkey, which is just the incredible passion and intensity that people feel for their football clubs. But then at the same time, it's very contradictory. Here this fan is willing to do anything for the team to set the world on fire, but then nobody can be bothered to turn up to greet the latest signing just because he's a defender. This passion is expended only in certain directions and at certain times. And for me, it was a really interesting contrast. The British football fan, their fandom is kind of what I call a rolling, consistent plod. You go to games, you're never overly happy, you're never despondent to the point of quitting, or at least as a Leicester City fan, one year aside. But Turkish football seemed to just be characterised by huge peaks and troughs. Like every waking moment is devoted to the side when they're doing well. And then when they're in a trough, then they're just dropped like a stone and people don't even go to the games. But today's stadiums are not wholly passive, and football is not completely under the thumb of the government, contrary to how it might sometimes look to outsiders and insiders. Indeed, the government's reach into the big three is arguably more limited than elsewhere in society. I think that football is more untouchable than schools or universities or media outlets. It has enormous cultural weight. Obviously, the vast numbers of fans, and so they're very difficult to conquer. But this doesn't mean that there haven't been attempts. Most interesting is the new arrival on the scene of a club called Başakşehir, founded 4 years ago by a relative of President Erdogan, where he was part of the consortium. They're currently challenging for the Premier League title, playing very, very good football as a result, at the same time. But there is a problem. They have no fans. They have literally a few thousand who go to the games. So in terms of their cultural power, they're not really rivaling these big teams, the Fenerbahce, Galatasaray, and Beşiktaş. And arguably, they never will. So for now, although a lot of the football fans I know feel very negative and worried about the current political situation, I think that football remains a slightly freer realm. And this was brought home to me at the opening of the new Beşiktaş Stadium in 2016. Beşiktaş were playing Bursaspor and they won 3-2. But it wasn't the game. It was kind of what happened afterwards that really interested me. And I'm going to finish or draw to a close by reading a final little extract from the book of the aftermath of this game in 2016. So outside, the atmosphere was anarchic. The crowd from the stadium combined with the larger ticketless mass just desperate to be there. Boys on motorbikes were gunning their engines and honking their horns, while their friends on the back waved black and white Beşiktaş flags. I passed 4 young men crawling along in caterpillar formation, shouting and singing as they made their way down the middle of the street on their hands and knees. Walking through the chaos, I couldn't help but reflect on the disparity. The government had been exerting a tighter and tighter grip. But here I was, in a wild, untamed mass of people doing whatever they liked. I reached central Beşiktaş. The square was filled with 500 or so people chanting at the tops of their voices. The ground completely covered in beer bottles, cigarette packets, and a mush of wet cardboard. There was a constant background tinkle of breaking glass as drunken fans got up from nearby tables and staggered giddily into the nearby streets. You can keep tightening people, but there's a natural energy to a crowd that can spurt up in unexpected ways. In modern Turkey, where people cannot congregate in large groups or speak their minds without fear of sanction, for many people, football is the last realm in which they can breathe. I think this lack of control is why the government doesn't like football fans as a social grouping. But this is also why I'm consistently drawn to them and to football. This unpredictability, this giddy, heady excitement of surrendering autonomy to the crowd. This happens at matches in England too, of course. But in Turkey, it just feels more loaded with potential, both positive and frightening. I speak of a game that gives hope, said Erdogan in 2017. From the deserts of Africa to the Brazilian slums, everywhere in the world, it gives hope to kids who life has shoved to the side. He was talking about the players, but football also gives hope to the fans. For those who are angry or worried about the direction of their country, the game is a chance to melt into a mass of people, to forget what is going on elsewhere, or to find the inspiration and solidarity to try and change it. Thank you.
Thank you. I know a lot more about football, probably not about the positions on the football match, on the football field, but certainly how much politics can play into football games. Are you happy to take some questions?
I am, yeah, absolutely. But just before doing that, I want to give some thanks to a few people, really. I didn't want to do it at the start because I wanted to get into things. But there are people, maybe if you're a novelist, then writing a book is quite a singular endeavor. But that's definitely not the case for this work. Foremost amongst my thanks has to go to David and Nick, my agents at David Luxton Associates, who, when I first sent my proposal a good 4 years ago, didn't put it in the bin, but said, this sounds interesting, let's work on it, and took it to a publisher, and here we are today. So I certainly wouldn't be here, and this certainly wouldn't be here, without their support and guidance. So I thank them both very deeply. And then there's another person involved in that chain who is also integral to this book in my hands. And that's Paul Murphy at Orion, my editor, who, when approached by David and Nick, didn't chuck them out, but said, oh, that sounds all right, yeah, why not? And took the book on and guided me as a rookie author through the kind of rapids of the highs and the lows and the ins and the outs and the missed deadlines of writing a book. So I'm very grateful to his calm and experienced steer. Thirdly, and it's equally as essential really, is the British Institute. I have to thank everyone involved there, but especially its director, Lutgard van der Put, who recruited, for making me postdoctoral fellow there. The research and writing of the book, like the vast majority of it, took place whilst I was a scholar, and I certainly wouldn't have been able to do it full time and with the fervency which I did without their support. There's another person outside of that chain whose support was equally important to me, and that's my partner Laura. She provided not only kind of the support of the, material, moral, and culinary, but far more importantly, it was an extremely integral part of the research, writing, and editing process, framing ideas, editing, making sure that the prose didn't sound awful. If it wasn't for her, this would be twice as long and half as interesting. And finally, just a big thanks to family and friends more broadly, many of whom are here today, which I'm very thrilled about. their support at various stages, or simply just not being fed up of me talking about this one thing for so many years, has actually been truly touching, and it's really great to kind of be here with you today to sort of, push it off into the world. So now please go and write good reviews on Amazon. Okay, so sorry to take your time up with those, but they were very important for me. But yeah, now I'm willing to answer any and all questions that you might have.
We do have some books on sale when we leave this room and go into the next room for a drink. But before we do that,
John, I think we're going to be signing as well, aren't we?
Yes, I'm happy to sign any books if people want them signed. Might decrease the value, but.
Just wait for the mic to come over to you. Gentleman in the corner.
Okay, coming. I'm not convinced this mic's on, by the way.
Simon behind you.
Half the guy is holding his hand up. Does it work?
I can hear you, it's all right.
Yes. Can I ask two questions? One is, even before you mentioned Laura, I was wondering what on earth the women were doing while the blokes were doing all that. And the second thing, completely different, where do the native players come from? Are there academies, or do coaches and people come from little teams and feed in through a network?
Great, okay. Do you want me to take a few questions or respond one-on-one?
I think respond.
Sure. Very good question. What about the women? As I kind of alluded to in passing early on, football in Turkey is very codified as very male, alpha male almost. There's a chapter in the book, actually, chapter 10, which goes into detail about kind of the history of this, where it comes from, and actually how malign an effect it has really on wider society and culture as well, that it's become so male-dominated. And I spoke to quite a lot of people who are both men and women who are trying to change perceptions, but really it's kind of a drop in the ocean, really. So, I mean, women do feature in the story. I think also as an anthropologist, you are very much limited by your own subjectivity. And as a male anthropologist, it very much was pulled in directions which made it harder, but not impossible, just harder to understand better the female experience. I have two very good friends and colleagues in Turkey who write extensively about women in football, and I can give you some references afterwards if you're interested. In terms of the native players, well, I mean, they come through a variety of ways, but the Turkish kind of grassroots structure is not particularly great in terms of nurturing talent. There's incredible talent in Turkey, very, very skillful football-obsessed nature. But it's not Germany or Holland where people are kind of hot-housed at an early level all the way through. A lot of talent kind of falls by the wayside. And a lot of the top divisions are filled with foreigners, actually. I mean, after the Premier League is the world's most foreign-dominated league with something like 60-odd%. But Turkey's not far behind. I think 55% of players in the top division are foreign players. And they're mostly old. So a lot of these top sides, Galatasaray played last weekend, I think they had 2 or 3 Turkish players in their starting 11. So there are native players, and there are some clubs which are very good. Altanor do in the second division, for instance, a really good side at developing talent. But I think it's almost just an embarrassment of riches, and that these clubs kind of pick on. It's not a particularly well-functioning system, unfortunately.
Thank you very much for that talk. As an Arsenal fan, I'm hearing a lot at the moment about the values of a club, not just how you happen to be performing on the pitch at a particular time. I'm wondering how the 3 big clubs in Istanbul see each other and themselves in that sense.
In what sense?
In the sense of, do they feel that they stand for something different from the other clubs, or is it just a question of each of them choose different symbols?
That's a good question. And also, as an Arsenal fan, thank you for choosing my talk over Atletico
Don't
Madrid.
worry, I'm hurrying off afterwards.
Okay, you're not alone. there are others who I'm also. There's also some who went the other way and were going to be here, but I couldn't really, having written a book about football, I couldn't really be too bad. I think that it's quite a deep question, or quite hard to summarise. But I mean, I think that all three of these clubs do feel a sense of, as I said, a sense of entitlement and specialness, really, above and beyond everyone else. In terms of between themselves, it's a funny mixture of on the one hand that sometimes there is a sense of them all being more like each other than, for instance, a typical supporter of the government. But at most of the time, they're at each other's throats, really, and they're exemplifying their differences. And there's a cute distinction which many in Turkey often trot out, especially Beşiktaş fans, and it goes like this: Galatasaray are the team of the aristocracy, Fenerbahçe are the team of the middle classes, and Beşiktaş are the halk takım, the people's club. But it's not really true. As I said, all of them have such wide supporters bases that they are too big to really generalise, and therefore their values kind of are too amorphous. I mean, that distinction comes because Galatasaray historically come from a very elite public school. Sorry, not public in the English sense, state school. So, for instance, a lot of their early players were aristocrats, but the same is true for the others. Today, yes, perhaps graduates from this school have a disproportionate influence in the Galatasaray members, but not at the fan levels. More Kurds support Galatasaray than any other side. So it's quite hard, actually. This is the thing about football, not just in Turkey, but I feel as if football clubs are kind of like receptacles, and we just pour into them whatever meanings we want. And that's one reason I think why football clubs become so... people develop such emotional attachment to them, because they're flexible. They're kind of giant containers, or maybe that's the wrong metaphor. But they can hold a lot of competing images. One person likes Arsenal because they are stingy and they don't spend much, and another person likes them because they the football they play. Another person likes them because of their link to North London and blah blah blah. And I think it's the same for these three clubs. I mean, I think that people often get really angry when I say this because I'm treading on that exact emotion. But I feel that actually they're all so huge that people weave a story around them in many very diverse ways.
It's all right. I don't think I need the mic.
It's being recorded.
What?
It's actually being recorded.
All right, okay. Given that infants are recruited as supporters, is change of allegiance totally unknown? And how do things work in the Turkish diaspora? Because in Sweden, where I worked for 3 years, I do recall seeing the colours of Galatasaray, and one wonders what will happen to a supporter of the other two clubs who emigrated there.
Good question. Change of allegiance happens sort of quite a lot when people are kids, less so when they're adults. But I've noticed a disparity between discourse and reality. And in discourse, obviously, you never change your football team. Mine till I die. It's passed down through my family for many years. But then actually, when you pick away at the substance, at the stories, stories diverge a bit. For instance, my dad wanted me to support Galatasaray, but my uncle convinced me to support Beşiktaş. So even within families, there's a competition, because not all families are simply one side. Some are, but the vast majority have a mixture. And even though people might not change their allegiance, they certainly go in and out of enthusiasm. So certain people will, perhaps they accept that they're Fenerbahçe fans, but they never even go to games or even watch games if the team aren't doing very well. So I mean, the discourse is obviously the same the world over. My team is my team, it never will change. In reality, I don't know, especially when people are children, there's a lot of jostling, and it's kind of like, you've seen, it's almost like a coming-of-age thing. It's like, well, now I'm an adult, I can choose for myself without being influenced. So there's a bit of play there. And in terms of the diaspora, that's really good. If I can plug the book, there is a chapter chapter devoted to the question of Turkish football in Europe amongst the kind of almost 5 or 6 million Turkish speakers who live in Europe. And again, just like in Turkey, it's intertwined in diaspora life in a multitude of ways. So the most interesting is that you have kind of supporters clubs and supporters groups for all of these three kind of mirrored in the diaspora. So in Stockholm, or Sweden more generally, perhaps, there will definitely be Galatasaray fans, but I'll eat my hat if there isn't also a Beşiktaş and a Fenerbahçe dernek. And I know for a fact that there are in England, Germany, Holland, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, because I've been to them. I actually visited a lot of these for my PhD research. So there is a real diversity, and again, the way that that's also very interesting, that a lot of Turkish speakers in Europe, if you say, which team do you support? Again, this many will say a Turkish team first. And, the Norman Tebbits of the world will see that perhaps as a suggestion of a failure of integration, which I would say quite strongly is kind of missing the point, really, that football identity, like many aspects of identity, is very kind of reflexive and playful. And I think that, defining as a Beşiktaş fan first doesn't mean that you're somehow burnt your UK passport. It just means that, living in Stoke Newington or whatever, for 2 hours on a Sunday, you like to kind of emphasize that part of your personality. So it's a very complicated story, but hopefully that shows, a bit more.
Thank you. As a Liverpool fan, of course, as soon as you say Istanbul, then we're taken back to our scene of not only fantastic hospitality from Turkey, but also the scene of our greatest triumph, which maybe did something to correct some of the views of Man United and Leeds. But
that's true.
I'm struck by going back into 1903 and when these clubs were formed. They were Istanbul was a very different place in those days. It was much more diverse. There was and you alluded to the link between Galatasaray and the Kurdish community, and I think there's a link between the Armenian community and Beşiktaş. I'm not sure. But I was wondering whether at the club's birth there was any identification with any of the different communities in Istanbul at the time, and what impact that had now, and also on the question of racism, because there has in the past been some degree of racism at Turkish football, and of course that becomes harder to sustain if the guy scoring the goals is black. Well, how can you, if you're cheering his name, how can you? And I was wondering whether there'd been any positive evolution on racial attitudes in Turkey that you could attribute as an anthropologist to football.
Thank you. Two very good questions. So on the talk of the club's foundation, this forms a lot of the material for the second chapter in the book, which is looking at the foundation of these three clubs and how they've kind of grown to become, the situation we've seen today. And you're quite right that when they were founded in the early 1900s, Istanbul was very different, and Turkish football was first played by initially kind of foreigners from Europe, and then by minorities, mostly, which in the case of Istanbul is predominantly Greek speakers and Armenians. But there were clubs set up along rough ethnic lines, and these three clubs were set up by Turks. So nowadays, given the nationalist narrative, and Turkey obviously went on to become an individual country, and as nationalisms the world over do, wants to claim its identity, these clubs have become seen as very Turkish. But actually, in those early decades, they were far more fluid. The first Galatasaray side, there's a picture on a picture of the first Galatasaray side from 1905. And in the front row, with his legs crossed, is a man with a moustache which looks a bit like the head of a brush. It's a very good moustache. And he was actually called Horace Armitage and was, an Englishman. And the list of the first 11 of the Galatasaray side that won the championship for the first time in 1909, it reads like an example of I found it. Great. I can stop mumbling. Ahmet Robinson, Milo Bakis, Hassan, Horace Armitage, Fuat Hüsnü, Idris, Kirill Stereo, Celal Ibrahim, Hayton, Emin Bülent, and Bekir. So, for those of you more familiar with the milieu, that's a mix of Greeks, Armenians, Turks, and what are called Levantines, which are kind of European-based players. So, those early years were far more diverse than often subsequent histories have painted them. So nowadays, often that is kind of really, like the world over, nationalism's kind of trumpeted in the kind of subsequent decades of the 20th century, and a lot of that gets missed out. So nowadays, they're seen essentially as Turkish clubs, really. And I mean, Besiktas had a Terrace leader who was Armenian, and that was seen as a huge thing. It was a huge deal. And, I mean, in many ways it was, that he was openly admitting, to being Armenian in a country where it's often very, you receive a lot of prejudice and racism for doing so. And I don't want to downplay that. That was a big deal. But that is really the exception. I mean, it is essentially kind of not, ethnicity doesn't feature into it very much. The second one about racism. There is racism in Turkish football, but I think it's much better and not so prominent as many other countries in the region. And I'm thinking mostly of Russia and Italy, which are two examples which have been in the news recently for quite high-profile racist incidents. In Turkey, there's kind of a weird discourse surrounding race, where a lot of people say that we're not racist because race is seen as basically something from America, and it's black and white, and there aren't really black people in Turkey, so therefore racism doesn't really exist, which is obviously not true. And if you were to speak to someone who feels very strongly about being Kurdish, then it's very clear it's not true. But at the same time, it has fed into an idea where I actually think that, I mean, I'm not an expert on Italy and its football, for instance, but I do think that the discourse of race is just very different. It's just not so prominent in Turkey. The dividing lines are often other elements. And I think the best example, which is mentioned, so I keep plugging the book, but I don't mean, it's more just that like I just remember them and I have it here for me. But there's a guy called Pascal Numa who is French, a black Frenchman who played for Besiktas for 2 years in the early 2000s. He has become a club legend. He is loved and adored. Turkey is now his home. He's learnt fluent Turkish. He acts in Turkish films. He sells drinks on Turkish television. He is essentially the Eric Cantona of Turkey. And he's loved beyond Besiktas fans. He's not simply seen it. So it's not like something which is just like Besiktas are the non-racists or whatever. One journalist tweeted about 6 months ago a kind of, it was a racial slur. It wasn't a full-on thing aimed at Galatasaray striker, current striker, another Frenchman called Gomez. And the next game, Galatasaray arranged for the whole stadium to have 55,000 masks of this player, and all the fans wore masks of the player, and there was a huge outcry in the press, and basically this journalist was ostracized for saying this. So I actually think that Turkey is pretty, when it comes to racism in football, it does exist. I do work with amateur football, African players who play in amateur leagues in Istanbul, and they certainly experience racism. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I do think it's not as bad as some other places.
One last question.
2 questions. First,
in the last 10 years, has the Premiership been won by each of those three clubs, or has another club won it? And the second question is, does Turkish football benefit from the vast, or well, I'm not sure it is benefit, influx of television right money that dominates English football today?
Okay, yeah, the first one is that there was 1 year when, in the last 10, in which one of these didn't win, and that was 2010, when a club called Bursaspor won for the first time in their history. But this was truly exceptional. The first division was established in 1959. Before that, it was regional divisions. So we've got, a good 50, 55, almost 60 years. And in that time, only 7 years one of these three hasn't won the league. So that shows their hegemony. Trabzonspor won 5 league titles, and Bursaspor have won 1 league title. So apart from that, in the last 60 years, one of these three has won. So they really have a lot of power. But that's why this year's quite interesting as well, because it's a 4-horse race at the moment. These three, and then this new upstart club, Başakşehir. So if they win, again, that will throw a cat amongst the pigeons. Perhaps not at the fan level, but in terms of the structure of the game. And the television rights questions, yeah, absolutely. It's not quite the same as the silly money in the Premier League, but there has been a huge increase in the rights. And the recent ones went for something like $500 million. And they're owned by a Qatari company called BIAA Sports, which owns the rights to a lot of football in the Middle East. And yeah, I'm not entirely certain why they've paid that much for them, but they have, and so there is a big influx. They're distributed less fairly than in the Premier League, and so, again, the big three receive a lot more, and again, it's another way of kind of perpetuating the hegemony. But it's definitely seen a lot of the same process of gentrification and commercialisation, which you're used to in England or Germany or any Western European country. It's there in Turkey. It's not any different, really.
I'm sure John won't mind having a chat next door over a glass of drink, but let's just once again say thank you very much, John. Really enjoyable talk.
Thank you.